From a lost fortress to a bizarre dragon park left in ruins, here are 10 of the most mysterious abandoned places on the water. Number 10. The Fort of LAJE. The LAJE Fort is situated in Guanabara Bay near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Its history goes back to 1555 when the Frenchman Nicolas Villegagnon thought he would start engaging in an armed conflict against the people who controlled Brazil at the time. That's right, he tried to take possession of the island to shoot cannons at the Portuguese. It didn't work, and 30 years later, the government of Rio de Janeiro suggested a huge fortress to be built on the island. Of course, with the way things work, it didn't happen until 1644. But even after the huge fortress was completed, it wasn't of much use. In 1711, it offered no help when the French attacked. The fort was improved in 1715, but still never really came in handy. That is, until it was used in 1836 as a prison. It continued to hold various prisoners and to be used in several military uprisings until eventually it was damaged by bombs in 1893. Then in 1903, it was updated and powerful cannons were installed, along with electricity. But through the years, the fort proved of little use each and every time until it was mostly abandoned. Today, the fort is a decaying pile of concrete on the water and nobody's really sure what to do with it, with locals unsure what it was ever used for in the first place. It looks like an awesome place to do some dangerous urban exploring, if you're into that kind of adventure and you're just the right type of fearless. Number 9. Floating McDonald's Barge. The floating McDonald's barge is one of the weirdest failed experiments in restaurant history, as if anyone ever thought to themselves, I would really love some McDonald's when slowly getting seasick. I mean, really, who would want the risk of throwing up their McNuggets and fries? Would you risk it? I wouldn't. The barge was presented in Vancouver in 1986 for the World Expo of Transportation and Communication. It was like any other McDonald's at the time, except it floated. The barge was used heavily in 1986, but after all the foreigners left, the locals weren't that interested in burgers on the water. It fell into disuse, was abandoned, and in the past 30 years has been used as nothing except for one of the film locations for the movie Blade Trinity. The fate of the McDonald's barge is unknown and shrouded in mystery. There have been attempts through the years to refurbish the barge and make it back into a restaurant, but it's never happened. It was anchored in the Burrard Inlet for 30 years before being towed to Maple Ridge, where it is still floating and decaying with barely any hope of ever being used again. Number 8. Battleship Island. The ruins of Battleship Island are about as spooky and as mysterious as it gets. The proper name for the island is Hashima Island, located in Japan's Nagasaki Prefecture. It looks like the site of an apocalyptic civilization where all the humans have been eradicated, but in truth, the island began as an undersea mining operation purchased by the Mitsubishi Corporation in 1890. The island was uninhabited at the time, but was swiftly transformed by building homes, shops, schools, and everything else needed for a modern society. By the time the 1950s rolled around, the population was up to 5,000, and the island was a self-sustained city of miners. But why does it look like some type of devastating plague or curse fell on Battleship Island? Where did the people go? It's because coal prices plummeted and the island became redundant. By 1975, there was no reason for anyone to live on the island. Everybody was evacuated. But here's what a lot of people don't know. Before and during World War II, the Japanese shipped prisoners of war to Battleship Island and forced them to work as slaves in the mines, something that resulted in what historians estimate could be thousands of unrecorded deaths. Being a prisoner of war is one of those things you might be fascinated by when you read about it, but no one in their right mind would ever want to be one. Number 7. The Floating Palace. There is a mysterious floating palace in India that has been haunting the middle of a lake for hundreds of years. The palace is located in Mansagar Lake in Jaipur. It looks like something out of Arabian Nights, with its beautiful yellow facade and trees literally growing out of its roof. But the history behind the water palace, named the Taj Mahal, is a little strange. The problem is that nobody really knows for sure who built it or when. Would you live in a palace with a mysterious past like that? I sure wouldn't. As far as historical records show, the Taj Mahal was constructed 300 years ago for the main purpose of giving the ruling Maharaja a place to relax, have picnics, and hunt ducks. In other words, it was a rich ruler's private retreat. So private that it was built partially submerged underneath the lake. So, why was the floating palace abandoned and left to rot for 200 years? Nobody is really sure. The palace doesn't actually have a single chamber. Instead, it boasts only a courtyard with a garden on its top. It was probably seen as useless, so the locals just ignored it, allowing sewage from the lake to slowly seep through the cracks in the stone. Eventually, the dirty water basically rotted away the construction materials, and now there is almost no reason to visit the palace other than a morbid curiosity about its past. Number 6. Abandoned Chateau. There's an abandoned chateau in France near Les Trois Moutiers that is almost inaccessible, seeming to float in the middle of its very own lake. The chateau is in a rapid state of decay, and yet amazingly, it was just purchased by a group of 11,000 strangers who pooled their money together through a French crowdfunding service, essentially adopting the castle. It's called Château de la Montchonnière, and it was built probably in the 13th century. The amazing structures was owned by the Attorney General of France until the 1770s, when the French Revolution caused the castle to be abandoned. There was a plan to reconstruct the ruin in the 1800s, but it never happened. Then, even though the castle is floating on the water, it suffered a devastating fire in 1932, even after being purchased in 1981 by a wealthy man who wanted to save it. The castle just didn't seem to want to be saved. But now, the group of strangers has paid over $500,000 collectively for the chateau. It's not sure how they're going to split up the castle, but the plan is to bring it back to its former glory, and hopefully even clean out the dirty moat it's sitting in. Would you crowdfund a castle like that? Tell me your thoughts in the comment section below. Then remember to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about cool abandoned stuff. Number 5. MAUNSELL Sea Forts. The MAUNSELL Sea Forts are just plain weird. These creepy relics from World War II are steeped in mystery. They're located off the coast of England, used during the war as naval fortifications. Their primary objective was to stop enemies from landing on the coast and to prevent enemy bombardments by firing at the German aircraft with artillery. The forts were considered a terrible idea in the beginning because they cost so much money, but they soon proved their worth. With their massive guns and 40mm cannons, the forts helped to prevent air raid squadrons from passing the Thames estuary and attacking Liverpool, a critical port needed to secure goods from the United States. The fort couldn't stop all the attacks, but they certainly did their part. After the war, the forts were no longer needed. They fell into disrepair and one by one crumbled into the sea. One of the forts was taken over by pirate radio in the 1960s, and an artist even tried to live in one back in 2005. But now, after decades guarding the coast, the creepy forts have nearly totally been destroyed. Number 4. Lost Russian Dam. There is a very spooky abandoned dam in Russia, sitting half-finished waiting to be completed or destroyed. Construction on the Kropovinsky Dam began in 1975. It was to be erected in the Kemerovo region, but it ran into trouble and never managed to recover. The 1980s saw a huge string of protests against the dam, with every day people trying to defend the environment by preventing its construction. The project was suspended temporarily in light of the movement, but then the workers never came back. They actually left the dam not even half finished, with steel girders and concrete columns still standing in the middle of the remote Russian lake even today. There are plans in place to renovate and rebuild the dam, but to be honest, it's not optimistic that the dam will ever be finished. For now, it's just an ugly and mysterious eyesore in the middle of an otherwise beautiful landscape, with unused construction equipment slowly rotting and ruining the view. Number 3. The Floating Hospital. Today, the Floating Hospital is a non-profit organization that gives healthcare services to less fortunate people in New York City. It's a land-based operation, but back in the 1800s, it was literally a floating hospital. The organization began on the Emma Abbott in 1876, which floated through the New York harbor and welcomed on board poor children to get free medical service. The hospital was staffed by pediatricians, nurses, dentists, and even social workers. And the best part, other than being a young child and getting to go on a boat, was that the healthcare was completely free. This was way ahead of its time, and even freer than the healthcare is today. In the 20th century, the floating hospital served roughly 5 million children. Part of the treatment was simply to be on a boat and breathe clean air, as New York was considered to be one of the most polluted and toxic places anywhere in America. However, the floating hospital was eventually abandoned. The Emma Abbott vanished, and nobody seemed to know where it went. And the last vessel, the Lila Atchison Wallace, was retired in 2003. Number 2. The Floating Hotel. The Floating Hotel opened in 1988 off the coast of Australia, promising to be a paradise resort floating on the Great Barrier Reef. It was a megastructure, 7 stories tall with 200 rooms, a helicopter landing pad, a tennis court, and an underwater observatory. However, things didn't turn out well for the Floating Hotel. Over the next 10 years, it floated thousands of miles across the ocean and came to rest in the waters of North Korea. It's abandoned, decaying, and no longer of any use to anyone. But how did this happen? The public opening of the Floating Hotel was delayed by a tropical cyclone. Some of the amenities were damaged. The underwater observatory sank, and the transfer shuttle, used for getting passengers to the actual hotel, was destroyed. It was then discovered that over 100,000 discarded pieces of ammunition, artillery rounds, and explosives from World War II were resting directly beneath the barge. It was a complete failure. The hotel closed within the same year it opened. From there, the hotel was floated to Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. It was a huge success and became a wildly popular entertainment venue for over 10 years, until the owners ran into financial trouble. The hotel was then floated to North Korea in 1997, where it stays to this day. It ran into some trouble in 2008 when a North Korean soldier shot a visiting tourist from South Korea inside the vessel. Since then, the Floating Hotel has been eerily silent. And number 1, Abandoned Dragon Park. There is a creepy abandoned water park in Hue, Vietnam, floating on the water after being closed down just 2 years after it opened. Today, the giant dragon statue in the center of the park, rearing its ferocious head out of the water, is a monument to a failed dream. The park isn't on a single map, and is not the easiest place to find. It's somewhere near the ancient city of Hue. We know it was built for around $30 million, opening in 2004. When it opened, nobody wanted to visit it. It may have been cool to look at with its dragons and silly attractions, but the locals didn't have much interest in a corny theme park, and there wasn't enough time to make the park popular for foreigners. By 2006, the park ran out of money and closed. Today, the only people who come to the Floating Dragon Park to see the statues covered in graffiti are foreign backpackers looking for Instagram pictures. The locals believe the whole place is cursed and won't dare step foot on it. Plus, the water in which the park was built is said to be full of crocodiles, making it a rather perilous journey. You'd need an experienced crew of explorers, along with a few weapons for protection, to even think about entering this place. Which of these abandoned places would you love to visit the most? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe and come back for another awesome video. See you on the next one.